I've discussed a few times the utterly disastrous Marvel's Avengers game that launched in 2020. It was a cynical live service game driven by microtransactions for cosmetics and time savers with mediocre combat and interchangeable characters. Unless I've been told you played long enough to max out all the characters, at which point the game broke but you've given into Stockholm Syndrome and didn't care anyway. This catastrophe was published by the AAA studio presently speedrunning its own demise, Square Enix, and despite Avengers being an utter disaster, it was not the last Marvel game that Square got to publish. A year later, they got a second crack at Marvel royalty with Marvel's Guardians of the Galaxy, developed by Eidos Montreal and released for the PlayStations 4 and 5. Guardians is everything that Avengers wasn't. A linear story-based single-player adventure with no grinding, loads of in-game collectibles, and at least not looking like it was trying to ride the movie's coattails with stunt double-ass character models. And how did Square's second crack at a Marvel property turn out? Well, the next Marvel game was published by 2K Games, the loot box and sports people, so I'm guessing not well. Square's Guardians of the Galaxy sold like crap and was credited with playing a large part in Square selling off its Western studios. It said online that the failure was due to the Avengers game sharting the bed, but who knows for sure. So does Guardians of the Galaxy deserve its bad reputation, or did Square manage one more good game before flushing the business for NFTs? The game begins with the Guardians, just getting started as a team of mercenaries, entering a quarantine zone to capture a monster to sell to collector/trafficker Lady Hellbender, who, if I didn't know any better, I would swear was specifically invented to try and cast Autumn Ivy in a Marvel movie. Of course, the mission goes south, and the Guardians release an ominous shadow monster into the universe. And several hours later, thank you very much, decompressed storytelling, you find out the released monster is Magus, a godlike entity that's out to mind, slave, and feed on the entire universe, with a massive cult called the Universal Church of Truth acting as its enforcers, spreading its influence across the cosmos at an alarming speed. That's all daunting enough, but being early in their careers, the Guardians have their own problems. They're friends, but they're not working effectively as a team. Rocket's an asshole who wants everything to revolve around him, Drax is still mourning his dead family, Gamora's a loose cannon that nobody trusts, and Star-Lord's only barely keeping them together. You're in charge of this ragtag band of misfits as the last line of defense against an existential threat that seems increasingly impossible to defeat. Put simply, you are hopelessly screwed. And so it's up to the Guardians to bond into a proper team and come together for something bigger than themselves for the first time in their lives, and in particular it falls to Peter Quill to step up as the hero that he's always imagined himself to be. It's a compelling central conflict with huge personal stakes and arcs for all involved, a growing sense of dread as the villains get more and more powerful, and desperation as the Guardians try to figure out how they're supposed to fight God. So the bad guys are a cult that's out to murder everyone who doesn't convert to their beliefs. They're called the Church to the point that their power source is called Faith. They shield their platform by calling it Truth. They get power by promising their base whatever they want to string them along. When someone is pulled into the cult, they're trapped into a cycle of non-stop propaganda that they can only escape by recognizing the blatant lies. The main villain and supposed guy in charge, Grand Unifier Raker, is just a toady and shill sucking up to the real villain out of desperation with no power of his own. And you win the final boss fight by making fun of the villain because the whole party, the cult, wasn't actually about anything except fueling his own ego. Doesn't get much more subtle than that. Now, to the confusion of most everyone when the game was announced, you do not have full control over the Guardians team. You only play as Star-Lord, with the others being AI partners that you can command. Sort of. As Star-Lord, you run around in combat shooting people with relatively weak guns. You have a dodge move that does not interrupt your shooting, so the combat plays really smoothly. You don't have much health, and heals are scarce and have to be used carefully, so there's a good emphasis on dodging enemy attacks, and there's a timing minigame to quickly reload your guns every time they overheat. Both of these mechanics mean that you have to pay close attention in combat, which, at least to me, prevents it from feeling boring or monotonous. You can't sleepwalk through these encounters. And you have kick-ass elemental shots from Peter's gun serving as secondary fires. A lightning gun that stuns groups, a wind gun that pulls in ranged enemies to punch to death, a plasma gun that you only get for the last 2 levels because it friggin' melts people, and an ice gun that does basically nothing but you need it for some shields. You can also melee attack enemies to speed up your damage output, and that makes you pay attention too, since most enemies can counter punches, bring up a button prompt, and then you fail it because your instinct is to dodge instead of doing the QTE. The other Guardians basically function as your super moves. Each team member has a specialty to their attacks, runs on independent cooldowns, and can be ordered to launch powerful attacks in mid-combat. The general idea is that Rocket is area effect damage, Gamora is high damage on a single target, Drax is area effect stun, and Groot is also area effect stun, except he kind of more immobilizes enemies, whereas Drax deals a stagger status. They're different! The game said so! And as the game goes on, you unlock both new super moves for Star-Lord and new supers that the other characters can use. You're supposed to think tactically about when to use each character, but you won't. I prioritize Gamora for single targets, but the rest are kind of interchangeable in the heat of the moment. To be frank, if there's a major enemy on the field, I just call everyone to dogpile on the biggest threat, and I died maybe once or twice the entire campaign, so my lack of strategy seemed to work fine. And I can't tell much difference between the three abilities that each individual character has, even with unlocked new moves. Even towards the end, when everyone gets ultimate moves that do call for a hint of strategy, I just call whoever's not on cooldown, and it works out. You can also unlock new perks for Quill by exploring for components to craft upgrades, but I wound up sinking all of mine into health and mobility because you can barely do anything to buff your guns. Literally the one thing that you want to upgrade. One of the upgrades is a tactical visor to scan enemies in mid-combat, but everything dies by shooting it. This isn't rocket science. I bought the scan visor before the final bosses just because it was the last thing that I could afford, and the scan's advice for fighting Raker amounted to, "Don't get shot, dumbass!" The game mostly has a good variety of enemies between melee goons, ranged enemies, flyers, heavies with shields and mines, and they attack in good enough numbers to make combat hectic and fun, but honestly, groups do kind of feel the same by and large, and there are quite a few truly obnoxious damage sponges that you have to sink multiple supers into. Regardless of skin, a lot of the enemies just run and shoot, you know? They don't vary up tactics enough or have many special weapons. It's a good thing that I enjoyed the combat on its basic levels, because basic is about all you've got. Not a lot separates the encounters themselves. And locking ultimate moves and sidearms behind story events means that you won't have all your main combat abilities until the very last level, which is also kind of annoying. A really cool touch to the game is the huddle mechanic, which is basically an ultimate team super move that charges during combat. Peter calls the Guardians together to give them a pep talk in mid-fight, and if you choose the right dialogue, which is spelled out to your face with keywords, all the Guardians get a huge buff with refills to their supers and a health boost to yourself, complete with a song from Star-Lord's music collection starting over the fight to get everyone pumped up! It's a fun mechanic that goes a long way in selling Peter's role to the team, besides making great use of the game's excellent soundtrack. The shitty thing, though, is that the song that plays over the fight is randomized, and a lot of the choices on here are just baffling.
I am with you, Peter Quill!
This is gonna be fun!
Let me in! This ship is unholy! It only takes one egomaniac and a
Take on Me is on here, just about as random as when it popped up in the Mario movie for no damn reason. That shit must be really cheap to license. Everybody Wants to Rule the World is on here, which makes absolutely no sense as a rollicking action tune to psych up the group. I got We Built This City and Don't Fear the Reaper, both great songs, but neither is very action-y. I mean, I guess they kind of make sense in a Get Off Our Turf and a We Are an Unstoppable Force sense, respectively, but you aren't really looking for mind games with your psych-up music. But what absolutely takes the cake is what happened to me during the climactic final boss fight. I'm in the final showdown with Grand Unifier Raker, he's on his last health bar, and I rally the team because I'm low on health and I want to make sure nothing goes wrong. One final push to take him out, and I swear that I have done nothing to this footage.
My faith protects me!
Are you shitting me? The game has now set the final boss to Don't Worry, Be Happy. I think the game is straight up trolling me at this point. Hold on, let me fix that. Razor, put you back in your seat. Since streaming is all the rage these days, the game also has an entire album's worth of royalty-free homemade 80s rock music, very much inspired by the likes of Metallica and Black Sabbath. It's a good album credited to a made-up Star-Lord band, and if you want to actually listen to any of these songs, you have to look them up yourself, because the only one that plays prominently in-game is Zero to Hero. They paid to produce an entire album of retro rock, and then they barely used it. In fact, a lot of the game could be described as way too much effort misappropriated into the wrong places. Guardians of the Galaxy is a fun game, but in my opinion, you just don't spend enough time actually playing it, because this game is loaded down with so abusively many overlong cutscenes and bits where you just walk while the characters chat, you wonder if you bought a game or a streaming miniseries. The game opens with an hour-long tutorial level, with a few fights against very weak enemies as you're shown how to fight and command the Guardians. The bulk of this opening level is walking from place to place while the characters idly chat with each other. But I'll cut it some slack. This game isn't following the movies and we need some introduction to the more comic book inspired status quo. Fair enough. Chapter 2, the Guardians get arrested by the Nova Corps. A ship explodes, and Star-Lord wanders the ship with a cadet named Nikki before meeting with an ex-girlfriend, Centurion Corell. It's 20 minutes of walking simulator with no combat or puzzles whatsoever. But fine, these are important characters for later in the story. I can let that one slide. The Guardians get slapped with a huge fine, and they're flat broke, so they decide to try selling either Groot or Rocket to Lady Hellbender for cash, and then they plan to break them out after. So you go to her planet and spend Chapter 3 slowly walking to Hellbender's fortress for another hour. Plus continued flashbacks to Peter's childhood, with all of 3 brief fights along the way. Eventually I figured out these fights are still tutorials to explain Peter's element guns, the momentum system, and enemies with multiple health bars. Now the game is testing my patience. There is no excuse for the walking sim parts of this chapter. All they do is build up Lady Hellbender with bullshit stories that have nothing to do with anything. Sure, there are a few puzzles, but the puzzles all boil down to use scan visor to find key items and look for spots that you can give the Guardians orders. Zelda laughs at your poor excuse for puzzles. At Hellbender's fortress, the deal goes south and the Guardians have to fight their way out, and it finally has you get into a good number of serious fights. Unless you chose to sell Groot like I did, which instead leads to a few utter cakewalk stealth sections. Then the Guardians go to pay their fine, find an abandoned Nova Corps station to investigate, spend 15 minutes wandering around the atmospheric dead space locale, and the plot finally kicks up, and now you get to a fair amount of actual combat. These are ridiculous. It took over 3 hours to get to any meaty gameplay. You could watch one of the Guardians movies and the Christmas special in the time it takes for the game to start. And this is with me skipping all the optional conversations on the ship and not dicking around the locations because I saw all of them on my first playthrough. In reality, you're probably looking at 4 hours before you get to any substantial gameplay sequences. And even then, once you're off the abandoned Nova ship, the game friggin' apologizes for having stuff actually happen, and you get dumped on nowhere for another hour plus of downtime! And don't get me wrong, nowhere's great. It's a bustling, non-linear area that brings the game world to life and adds to the immersion. But there comes a point where it's like, I bought this superhero action game for superhero action! I swear this is true. Most everybody that I've talked to about this game has told me that they quit on it like halfway through or sooner because they just got bored. And frankly, I can't say I blame them. Oh man, I love Chapter 9 where you get into a space battle dogfight with Captain Glory and the Lethal Legion. You fly the Milano with super responsive maneuverable controls. It plays a lot like Starlink with strafing thrusters and a boost. It's a lot of fun. So of course it's a short battle that you probably got to with insanely overpowered homing missiles, and there's exactly one other ship combat section in the game. Said other section is spent running past enemies to reach the cult stronghold as quickly as possible. The one other ship combat, your goal is to avoid the ship combat. I'm just saying, why go to all the trouble of even making a space battle gameplay mode if you're barely going to use it? More dogfights would have really livened up the game, and it's not like the Guardians never fight people with ships. The back half of the campaign is a lot more action-centric with a few entire chapters that are mostly combat. In a superhero shoot-'em-up game? Perish the thought! But even once the game finally gets going, a lot of the levels feel, quite frankly, padded. Like you'll land about 3 miles away from your destination and have to hike through tons of dead air while the Guardians banter. And the personalities of the characters shine throughout all of the writing, but I don't really need to listen to the team gossip about Fin Fang Foom for over half a damn hour straight before you get to the boss fight.
I want Fin Fang Foom.
There's the head of Fin Fang Foom.
Think Foom's in there?
Victims of Fin Fang Foom?
Now bring on Fin Fang Foom.
Fin Fang Foom.
Gotta be Foom's, right?
Fin Fang Foom. Fin Fang Foom. Fin Fang Foom.
It's Foom.
Fin Fang Foom.
They say Fin Fang Foom.
Or how about when Mantis leads you down into a cave and it's about a full hour of the Guardians going, "Are we there yet?" before the game gets to the damn point? Seriously, the game's ratio of cutscenes and walking sim to actual combat feels like 50-50 at bare minimum. And I just wonder, why? With how expensive AAA development is, was it really worth writing, directing, recording, animating, and rendering several hours worth of dialogue that ultimately doesn't advance the game? Or designing and rendering humongous exotic locales just to walk through for padding? Were they scared of the game being called too short? Was the scripting rushed and all the gameplay somehow got shunted off to the second half? It just perplexes me how the game ended up structured this way. Yahtzee of Zero Punctuation likes to call games like this ghost train rides. Heavily scripted, story-driven action games with big, impressive environments, but relatively simplistic combat, tight, narrow corridors, AI partners constantly pushing you forward, and progression and movement very tightly controlled. Hell, Guardians is so linear that you aren't even allowed to crouch back through tunnels to go back to the upgrading table after you just picked up the resources to use it. Yahtzee points to other popular series as examples of this genre, like Uncharted, the new Tomb Raiders, and other series that I missed by owning a Wii and Wii U. So, fair enough. Maybe this just isn't my genre. But if this is all the case, I wonder when a particular strain of AAA games decided to cut down on as much actual game as possible. I also ran into quite a few technical issues, which probably boil down to me playing the PS4 version of a PlayStation 5 game. My first playthrough, I had this humorous moment where Drax was hanging out on the ship with both of his swords poking out of his back. Peter Quill, there are 2 sharp pains in my back, and I can fathom no cause for either of them. The game crashed on me 3 times during this playthrough, all 3 of which felt like the game getting pissy that I actually used the system's suspend play feature, and the frame rate struggles to live through quite a few of the battles, with enemy animations regularly going chonky to lighten the load. At one point, I think the game bugged out and I was able to punch a guy endlessly after he was already dead. But again, obnoxious damage sponges. He might have still been breathing, I don't know. Also, I think Mantis either zoned out or has major anger issues with Drax because she's hypnotizing him to run into rocks endlessly. Even if there's way too much of it, the story and character writing are definitely the strongest points of Marvel's Guardians of the Galaxy. The game's dialogue has a ton of exchanges of the Guardians just chatting exactly like a group of good friends, going on a hike or lounging around a dorm room. It makes the characters not only likable, but relatable. The writing has a ton of personality that just makes it fun to hang out with these characters, and more believable and compelling when they open up about the skeletons in their closets. The story has a heavy central theme of trauma and how it affects people. The game's universe is set 12 years after a massive galactic-scale war inspired by the comics, and a big reason why Magus is able to gain so much power so quickly is, well, pretty much everybody is still devastated and traumatized by the death and loss on a cosmic scale. Everybody has lost someone or been forced to do things that shook them to their core, and Magus's promise sticks people into a comforting fantasy where they can pretend it didn't happen. And everyone lost will just come right back if you believe hard enough, and people buy into it because it's easier and the less painful way out. But trying to ignore that trauma is vastly more self-destructive and harmful. It's the same theme that WandaVision was built around, only a little more optimistic in its final outcome. Each of the Guardians has their own trauma that eventually explodes to the surface. Rocket's origins in a lab, Peter's loss of his mother, and the ultimate reveal of just what becoming a good guy cost Gamora during the war. And there are some extremely well-written and acted emotional scenes of the lead characters grappling with their issues.
I came to honor the memory of my family. Our families have been cast out of paradise, Peter Quill.
Of course we can't. couldn't you be friends with a monster?
My innocent little Camellia. She was the best of us both. They both were. They were.
I need her back. I don't care if it's not real. I need things to go back to how they were.
It's hiding those traumas and trying to grapple with them alone that alienates team members from truly bonding together, and once they let it out and confront it with the help of the people around them, they not only grow, they unlock their full potential in the form of massive ultimate moves that deal metric shitloads of damage. You could argue the themes are kind of unfocused when it gets to Peter's arc though, because Peter's arc isn't about trauma. He breaks out of his promise as soon as you figure out that you're allowed to shoot his ghost mom. Peter's arc is instead about responsibility. Peter wants the Guardians to be heroes for hire, but when shit hits the fan, their first instinct is to run. They just don't believe in the mission, not until Peter leads by example by realizing they need to fix their mistakes instead of running from them. Peter also finds out that the traumatized little girl suffering immense grief from the death of her mother and being exploited by Magus and Raker as the host destroying the galaxy might probably be his daughter. So now he's got another huge responsibility staring him down that he needs to be ready for.
Ha! Congratulations, Peter Quill. You will make a terrible father. Unless the child is dead, in which case, it does not matter.
And the game handles all these arcs and relatable themes while still being a rollicking space opera with tons of interesting characters, exotic and beautiful locales, and tons of humor and action. And there are multiple fun bits where the game gives you the freedom to just run around and goof off in this universe, like going to markets and gambling on Nowhere, or when you get into the Nova Corps computers and you can dick around looking up other Marvel characters before getting on with the plot. I think what's gone down as the game's signature moment is a one-off minigame where the Guardians are locked in their rooms, and you have to have the characters sing to make a Space Llama chew a panel that they need to get out. I am so not making that up! The game may be based on the comics, but it captures a lot of the spirit of the movies that made the characters so popular in the first place, balancing heart, emotion, and drama with comedy and high adventure. Guardians of the Galaxy has an excellently written and acted story. I just wish that great story didn't seemingly come at the expense of having more game in the video game. The title's biggest weakness to me is that you have to wait forever for the game to get started, and the gameplay and story segregation is so poorly handled that even once things get going, you'll still be slammed with extensive walking sim sections and 15 minutes of cutscenes at once. Marvel's Guardians of the Galaxy is a very good game, but I can easily see why it didn't catch on in the mainstream. The gameplay is fun, but doesn't excel at anything that it does, and there are a lot of times that you'll be begging the game to just shut up and let you get to said gameplay in the first place. It's still a fun, at times moving, and well-crafted space opera adventure, and Lord knows you should be able to find it for cheap these days. So if you passed on this, maybe worth checking out.
Hellbender's castle isn't even that far!
That is not a castle. It is an impregnable fortress.
So how do we impregnate it?
Ask Peter!
Let's just get closer!